Sometimes the most dangerous assumptions we make are about the people sitting right next to us. On a humid Saturday night in Jacksonville, Florida, what started as harmless bar banter between strangers would escalate into a shocking confrontation that nobody saw coming. A decorated Marine, fresh from deployment, thought he could intimidate a quiet woman enjoying her drink alone. He had no idea that behind her calm exterior was someone whose military training made his own look like child's play. What happened next would be captured on security cameras, shared millions of times online, and forever change how people think about making judgments based on appearance. This is the true story of when predator became prey, when assumptions became dangerous, and when one woman's hidden identity turned a typical night out into an unforgettable lesson about respect, power, and the deadly mistake of underestimating someone you've never met. The Rusty Anchor was the kind of bar where military personnel from nearby Camp Lejeune came to decompress after long deployments. Its weathered wooden floors had absorbed decades of spilled beer, whispered secrets, and the heavy boots of Marines seeking refuge from the intensity of military life. The dim lighting cast long shadows across red vinyl booths, while classic rock played softly from speakers that had seen better days. On this particular Saturday evening in late September, the autumn air carried the promise of cooler weather, but, inside the bar, the atmosphere was thick with humidity and anticipation. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the mahogany bar, nursing a whiskey neat while scrolling through her phone. To any casual observer, she appeared to be just another patron enjoying a quiet drink. Her auburn hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple black sweater and jeans that gave no indication of the extraordinary life she lived. At 32, Sarah had learned the value of blending into crowds, of appearing unremarkable when the situation demanded it. Her green eyes, sharp and observant, occasionally glanced up from her phone to scan the room with the practiced awareness of someone trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. The bartender, a gruff man named Mickey who had been pouring drinks at the Rusty Anchor for over 15 years, knew Sarah as a regular customer who always paid her tab, never caused trouble, and tipped generously. What he didn't know, what nobody in the bar that night knew, was that Sarah Mitchell was a highly decorated member of the Army's elite Delta Force, one of only a handful of women to ever earn that distinction. She had spent the last 8 years of her life in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, conducting operations that would never appear in any newspaper or government report. Sarah had been back stateside for exactly 3 weeks, following a particularly grueling 6-month deployment in Afghanistan. The transition from the adrenaline-fueled world of special operations to the mundane routine of civilian life was always jarring, and she found herself drawn to places like the Rusty Anchor, where she could sit quietly and process the memories that followed her home. The whiskey helped dull the edges of experiences that most people could never imagine, experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. As the evening progressed, the bar gradually filled with its typical Saturday night crowd. Groups of young Marines, fresh-faced and eager to blow off steam, clustered around pool tables and dartboards. Older veterans, weathered by years of service, occupied corner booths where they could observe the room while sharing stories that grew more embellished with each round of drinks. The mixture of youth and experience, of bravado and wisdom, created an electric energy that Sarah found oddly comforting. She had been sitting at the bar for nearly 2 hours when Corporal Jake Morrison walked through the front door. At 26, Jake cut an imposing figure at 6 feet 4 inches tall, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of rigorous military training. His crew cut was regulation perfect, and his bearing screamed Marine from across the room. He had recently returned from his second deployment to Iraq, where he had served with distinction as an infantry team leader. The combat ribbons on his dress uniform back home told the story of a young man who had seen action and emerged victorious. Jake was accompanied by 3 of his buddies from his unit, all of them riding the high of a successful deployment and ready to celebrate their return to American soil. They had started the evening at another bar closer to base, but Jake had insisted on coming to the Rusty Anchor because he had heard it was where the real Marines went to drink. He was the kind of person who believed that respect was something you took rather than earned, and he had developed a reputation for being aggressive with civilians who he felt didn't properly appreciate military sacrifice. As Jake and his friends claimed a table near the center of the bar, his eyes immediately locked onto Sarah sitting alone. Something about her solitary presence and apparent vulnerability triggered a predatory instinct that had been building in him throughout his military career. He saw an opportunity to demonstrate his dominance to his friends while intimidating someone he perceived as weak and defenseless. Jake had always been drawn to situations where he could exercise power over others, and the civilian world provided plenty of targets who couldn't fight back against someone with his training and physical advantages. Sarah noticed the new arrivals immediately, her peripheral vision cataloging their positions, body language, and potential threat levels without ever looking directly at them. Years of operating in hostile environments had given her an almost supernatural ability to assess dangerous situations before they fully developed. She recognized the type immediately: young Marines full of testosterone and false confidence, looking for someone to push around to make themselves feel important. She had encountered hundreds of men like Jake throughout her military career, and she knew exactly how these situations typically unfolded. What Jake and his friends couldn't see was the subtle change in Sarah's posture as she became aware of their presence. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, her breathing became more controlled, and her hands moved into positions that would allow for immediate action if necessary. These were reflexes developed through years of training and real-world application, automatic responses that occurred without conscious thought. To anyone watching closely, it might have looked like she was simply shifting to get more comfortable on her bar stool, but, in reality, she was preparing for potential conflict. The first hour passed without incident as Jake and his friends consumed beer after beer while growing increasingly loud and boisterous. Their conversation centered around their recent deployment, with each man trying to outdo the others with tales of combat heroics and near-death experiences. Jake dominated these conversations, his voice carrying across the bar as he regaled his audience with stories that grew more dramatic with each telling. Sarah could hear every word despite sitting 30 feet away, and she found herself quietly assessing the accuracy of his claims based on her own extensive combat experience. As the alcohol continued to flow, Jake's attention kept drifting back to Sarah. He began making increasingly crude comments to his friends about the attractive woman drinking alone, speculating about her personal life and suggesting various ways he could approach her. His friends, uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts were taking but unwilling to challenge their aggressive leader, mostly remained silent while occasionally offering weak protests that Jake ignored completely. The turning point came when Sarah finished her second whiskey and signaled Mickey for another. The simple act of ordering a drink somehow convinced Jake that this was his moment to make a move. He had consumed enough alcohol to override whatever minimal inhibitions he possessed, and the presence of his friends as an audience made the prospect of demonstrating his dominance even more appealing. Without considering the consequences or bothering to read the clear signals that this woman preferred to be left alone, Jake stood up from his table and began walking toward the bar. Sarah saw him coming in the reflection of the mirror behind the bar long before he reached her position. Every instinct screamed danger, not because she feared for her physical safety, but because she recognized the potential for this situation to escalate far beyond what anyone in the bar was prepared to handle. She had spent years learning to de-escalate conflicts before they became lethal, but she also knew that some people were determined to learn hard lessons regardless of the warning signs. As Jake approached, Sarah made a conscious decision to give him every possible opportunity to walk away from what was about to become the worst mistake of his life. She would be polite, firm, and clear about her desire to be left alone. What happened after that would be entirely up to him, but she was already calculating exactly how this encounter would unfold based on his body language, alcohol consumption, and the obvious need to prove himself in front of his friends. Mickey, who had been serving drinks long enough to recognize trouble when it walked through his door, watched Jake's approach with growing concern. He had seen countless bar fights over the years, but something about this particular situation felt different. The woman at the end of his bar had never caused any trouble, but there was something about the way she was sitting, something about the calm confidence in her posture, that suggested she was far more prepared for confrontation than Jake could possibly imagine. The moment Jake opened his mouth to speak, several things became clear to everyone in the immediate vicinity. This was not going to be a friendly conversation between strangers sharing drinks. This was going to be a test of wills between two people with very different ideas about power, respect, and the consequences of making assumptions about others. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change their understanding of what it meant to underestimate another human being. Jake slid onto the bar stool next to Sarah with the kind of arrogant confidence that only comes from never having faced real consequences for inappropriate behavior. The smell of beer and cologne wafted from him as he positioned himself deliberately close, invading her personal space in a calculated move designed to make her uncomfortable. His opening words were delivered with a smirk that he clearly believed was charming but came across as predatory to anyone paying attention. Well, what do we have here? Pretty lady drinking all alone on a Saturday night. That's just not right. His voice carried the slight slur of someone who had consumed just enough alcohol to remove his filter while maintaining enough coordination to feel dangerous. Name's Jake Morrison, United States Marine Corps. Just got back from Iraq where I was keeping people like you safe and free. Sarah didn't look up from her phone immediately, hoping that ignoring him would send a clear message that she wasn't interested in conversation. She had dealt with countless men like Jake throughout her military career, and she knew that engaging too quickly would only encourage more aggressive behavior. Her response, when it finally came, was delivered in a calm, steady voice that betrayed none of the warning signs that someone with Jake's limited experience should have recognized. I appreciate your service, but I'm just here to enjoy my drink in peace. I'm sure there are plenty of other people here who would love to chat. She finally looked at him directly, and, for just a moment, Jake caught something in her green eyes that should have made him reconsider his approach. But the alcohol and his inflated ego made him interpret her steady gaze as a challenge rather than a warning. Mickey, who had been watching this interaction with growing unease, stepped closer while pretending to clean glasses. In his 15 years behind this bar, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when situations were about to spiral out of control. The way the woman was holding herself, the controlled tension in her shoulders, and the deliberate precision of her movements suggested someone with training far beyond what most civilians possessed. But Jake was too focused on asserting his dominance to notice these subtle warning signs. "Oh, come on now, don't be like that," Jake continued, moving even closer until his knee was almost touching hers. "I'm trying to be friendly here. Buy you a drink, maybe get to know you better. You should be grateful that a real American hero is taking interest in you." His tone had shifted from what he probably thought was charming to something much more sinister, the underlying threat becoming more obvious with each word. Behind them, Jake's three friends were watching this interaction with varying degrees of discomfort. Private First Class Tony Rodriguez, the youngest of the group at barely 22, shifted nervously in his seat as he recognized that his team leader was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Corporal Mike Stevens, who had known Jake for 2 years, had seen this behavior before and knew it rarely ended well for anyone involved. Sergeant First Class David Park, the most senior of the group, was beginning to consider whether he should intervene before things escalated further. Sarah set her phone down on the bar with deliberate precision, the action so controlled and purposeful that Mickey unconsciously took a step back. When she turned to face Jake directly, there was nothing in her posture that suggested fear or intimidation. Instead, she radiated the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of when pushed too far. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this conversation and go back to your friends," she said, her voice still controlled but now carrying an unmistakable edge that should have warned Jake that he was approaching a line he didn't want to cross. "I'm not interested in your attention, your drinks, or your company. Find someone else to bother." Jake's reaction to this clear rejection was predictable for someone with his personality type. Rather than accepting the boundaries she had established, he interpreted her refusal as a personal insult that required immediate correction. His face flushed red with a combination of alcohol and wounded pride, and his voice rose enough to attract attention from other patrons throughout the bar. "Listen here, sweetheart, I don't think you understand who you're talking to. I've spent the last 15 months fighting terrorists so you can sit in this bar and drink your fancy whiskey. The least you can do is show a little respect and appreciation." He leaned even closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating whisper. "And I don't take rejection well from civilians who don't know their place." Several other customers had begun to notice the increasingly tense conversation at the bar. A group of construction workers at a nearby table paused their discussion to watch what was unfolding, while two women in their 40s who had been enjoying a quiet evening out began gathering their purses, sensing that the atmosphere was about to turn ugly. The bartender Mickey was now openly watching the situation, his hand moving closer to the phone he kept behind the bar for emergencies. Sarah's response was delivered with the kind of icy calm that veteran combat soldiers learn to recognize as a prelude to violence. "Let me make this very clear, Corporal Morrison. Your service doesn't entitle you to my attention, my respect, or my time. Your rank doesn't impress me, your deployment doesn't obligate me to anything, and your attitude tells me everything I need to know about what kind of Marine you really are." The use of his rank caught Jake off guard for just a moment. Most civilians didn't know military protocol well enough to identify ranks correctly, and something about the way she said it suggested familiarity with military culture that went beyond casual observation. But his ego was too invested in the confrontation to allow him to process this warning sign properly. "You know what your problem is?" Jake's voice was now loud enough that conversation throughout the bar had begun to quiet as people turned to watch the drama unfolding. "You're one of those entitled civilians who thinks you're too good for the people who protect your freedom. Well, let me tell you something, princess. In the real world, men like me take what we want, and right now I want to have a conversation with you." As Jake reached out to grab Sarah's wrist, several things happened simultaneously. Mickey reached for his phone to call the police, knowing that this situation was about to cross from verbal harassment into physical assault. Tony Rodriguez stood up from his table, finally, finding the courage to try to intervene before his team leader did something that would ruin his career. And Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of everyone's evening in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The moment Jake's fingers made contact with her wrist, Sarah's training took over. Years of muscle memory and countless hours of practice in hand-to-hand combat created an automatic response that was both lightning fast and precisely controlled. She didn't simply pull away from his grip, she twisted her wrist in a specific manner that not only broke his hold but applied pressure to nerve points in his hand that sent shooting pain up his arm. Jake jerked back in surprise and pain, his alcohol-impaired reflexes too slow to process what had just happened. For the first time since approaching her, he was forced to confront the possibility that this woman was not the helpless victim he had assumed her to be. The look in her eyes had changed from annoyed tolerance to something much more dangerous, and, even through his alcoholic haze, he began to realize that he might have seriously misjudged the situation. "That was your first warning," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You can walk away right now, go back to your friends, and pretend this never happened. Or you can continue this conversation and discover exactly why you should have listened to me the first time." The entire bar had gone quiet now, with every patron and employee watching this unprecedented confrontation between the seemingly mismatched opponents. Jake's friends had all risen from their table, uncertain whether they should try to defuse the situation or prepare to back up their team leader if things went physical. Mickey had his phone in his hand but hesitated to make the call, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be over long before the police could arrive. Jake, nursing his painful wrist and struggling to process the speed and precision with which she had countered his grab, found himself facing a choice that would define not only the rest of his evening but potentially the rest of his military career. His pride and alcohol-fueled aggression were pushing him toward escalation, while some deeper instinct that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments was screaming at him to back down immediately. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to see which path Jake would choose. Unfortunately for everyone involved, his ego and his assumption about civilian weakness won out over his survival instincts. Instead of walking away from a situation that was clearly beyond his understanding, Jake Morrison made the decision that would transform him from predator to cautionary tale in a matter of seconds. The moment of decision arrived like a thunderclap in the suddenly silent bar. Jake Morrison, his pride wounded more than his wrist, made the fatal mistake of doubling down on his aggression rather than heeding the clear warning signs that any experienced combat veteran should have recognized. His face twisted with rage and humiliation as he processed the fact that a civilian woman had not only rejected him but had physically countered his attempt at intimidation with skills that suggested training far beyond anything he had anticipated. "You think you're tough, huh?" Jake snarled, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of someone whose ego had been bruised beyond rational thinking. "Let me show you what a real Marine can do to smart-mouthed civilians who don't know their place." He stood up from his bar stool with the kind of aggressive posture that had intimidated countless people in bars across the country, his impressive physical presence suddenly seeming much more threatening in the confined space. Sarah remained seated on her bar stool, but every person watching could see the subtle shift in her positioning that transformed her from a relaxed patron into something entirely different. Her feet moved to positions that would allow for immediate mobility, her hands shifted into loose fists that could strike or defend in a fraction of a second, and her entire body language changed from defensive to what any military professional would have recognized as the calm preparation of someone ready for combat. Mickey, who had been bartending long enough to see countless fights break out in his establishment, later told police that he had never seen anything quite like what he witnessed in that moment. The woman's transformation was so complete and so professional that it reminded him of watching a documentary about military special forces preparing for action. Meanwhile, the Marine approaching her moved with the kind of clumsy aggression that suggested training focused more on intimidation than precision. "Last chance, Corporal," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. "Walk away now, or I will make you walk away. And trust me when I tell you that you won't enjoy the experience." The warning was delivered with such calm certainty that several patrons later reported feeling chills despite not being directly involved in the confrontation. Jake's response was exactly what Sarah had expected from someone with his psychological profile and level of intoxication. Instead of recognizing the obvious signs that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had assumed, he interpreted her warning as further disrespect that required immediate correction. His military training had taught him to be aggressive and decisive, but it had never prepared him for a situation where those qualities would work against him so spectacularly. "You want to threaten me? You want to threaten the United States Marine?" Jake's voice rose to a shout that echoed throughout the now completely silent bar. "Let me show you what happens to civilians who think they can talk tough to real warriors." With that declaration, he lunged toward Sarah with the kind of telegraphed attack that would have been laughably obvious to anyone with serious hand-to-hand combat training. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds and would be replayed countless times on security camera footage that would eventually go viral across social media platforms worldwide. Sarah Mitchell, whose Delta Force training included extensive instruction in neutralizing threats with minimal collateral damage, demonstrated why she was considered one of the military's most elite operators. As Jake's clumsy lunge brought him within striking distance, Sarah moved with the kind of fluid precision that comes from years of training and real-world application. She slipped off her bar stool with a movement so smooth it seemed like she was simply standing up to stretch, but her position now gave her perfect leverage for what came next. Jake's momentum carried him past where she had been sitting, and his alcohol-impaired reflexes were far too slow to adjust for her movement. Sarah's first strike was a precisely targeted blow to a pressure point on Jake's neck that immediately disrupted his balance and coordination. The technique, learned during advanced combat training that most Marines never experienced, was designed to incapacitate an opponent without causing permanent injury. Jake stumbled sideways, his vision blurring as his nervous system struggled to process what had just happened to him. Before Jake could recover or even fully understand what was happening, Sarah followed up with a joint manipulation that sent him crashing to the floor with a thud that shook glasses on nearby tables. The entire sequence was executed with such professional precision that it looked almost choreographed, like a demonstration rather than an actual fight. Jake found himself face down on the dirty bar floor, his right arm twisted behind his back in a position that made any movement agonizingly painful. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Move before I tell you to, and I will demonstrate why that would be a very poor decision." The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that even Jake, through his pain and confusion, understood that further resistance would only make his situation worse. The entire bar erupted in shocked exclamations and nervous laughter as patrons processed what they had just witnessed. The construction workers who had been watching began applauding, while the two women who had been preparing to leave sat back down to get a better view of the aftermath. Mickey stood behind the bar with his mouth hanging open, the phone forgotten in his hand as he tried to process how a seemingly ordinary customer had just dismantled a Marine with what appeared to be effortless ease. Jake's three friends sat frozen at their table, uncertain whether they should intervene on behalf of their team leader or simply pretend they had never met him. Tony Rodriguez, who had been contemplating stepping in earlier, now found himself grateful that he had hesitated. Mike Stevens was frantically trying to calculate how this incident would affect his own military career when word inevitably reached their command structure. David Park, the most senior of the group, was beginning to realize that their evening had just taken a turn that would require extensive damage control. Sarah maintained her position over Jake's prone form, her hand still controlling his arm in a way that kept him completely immobilized despite his significant size and strength advantages. To anyone watching, it was clear that she could have inflicted much more serious damage if she had chosen to do so. The restraint she was showing suggested training that went far beyond basic self-defense, training that taught precise application of force rather than maximum destruction. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," Sarah said, addressing the room as much as the man beneath her. "Corporal Morrison seems to have confused civilian with helpless, and assumed that military service gives him the right to harass women in bars." Her voice carried easily throughout the silent establishment, and several patrons began recording the scene with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jake, still struggling to understand how his evening had gone so wrong so quickly, tried to speak from his position on the floor. "You can't do this to me. I'm a Marine. You're just a civilian. This isn't right." His voice was muffled by his awkward position, but the indignation and confusion were clear to everyone listening. Sarah's response would be quoted in news articles and social media posts for months afterward. "You're right, Corporal Morrison. I'm not just a civilian." She paused for effect, allowing the room to absorb the implication of her words. "But you're not just a Marine either. You're a bully who thought he could intimidate someone based on assumptions about gender and military service. Tonight, you learned why assumptions can be dangerous." Mickey finally found his voice and stepped forward, though he maintained a respectful distance from the woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that clearly exceeded anything he had expected from a regular customer. "Ma'am, should I call the police? Are you hurt? Do you need any assistance?" His tone suggested that he was offering help to her rather than the man on the floor, a reversal that would have seemed impossible just minutes earlier. "That won't be necessary," Sarah replied, her attention still focused on Jake to ensure he didn't attempt any sudden movements. "I think Corporal Morrison has learned his lesson about consent and respect." "Haven't you, Corporal?" The question was directed at the man beneath her, and her tone suggested that his answer would determine how the rest of this encounter proceeded. The implications of what had just occurred were beginning to penetrate Jake's alcohol-fogged brain. Not only had he been humiliated in front of a bar full of witnesses, but he was beginning to suspect that the woman restraining him possessed military training that exceeded his own. The precision of her techniques, the calm authority in her voice, and the effortless way she maintained control suggested experience that came from sources he was only beginning to imagine. As the reality of his situation became clear, Jake Morrison faced a choice that would determine not only how this evening ended, but how the story would be told and retold in the days and weeks to come. He could continue to resist and potentially discover just how much more dangerous this woman could be, or he could swallow his pride and admit that he had made a terrible mistake in judgment. Unfortunately for his ego, only one of these choices offered any hope of salvaging what remained of his dignity. The silence and the rusty anchor stretched on as Jake Morrison wrestled with the reality of his situation. From his uncomfortable position on the beer-stained floor, with his arm twisted behind his back in a grip that made resistance impossible, he was forced to confront the fact that everything he thought he knew about this evening had been catastrophically wrong. The woman holding him immobilized was clearly not the helpless civilian he had assumed, and his attempts to intimidate her had backfired in the most humiliating way possible. "I'll ask again, Corporal Morrison," Sarah said, her voice maintaining that same calm authority that had characterized every word she had spoken since the confrontation began. "Have you learned your lesson about consent and respect, or do we need to continue this educational experience?" The pressure on his arm increased just enough to emphasize that she was completely in control of how this situation proceeded. Jake's pride battled with his pain and growing fear as he realized that continuing to resist would only make his situation worse. Through his alcohol-impaired thinking, he began to process the implications of what had just happened. The speed and precision with which she had neutralized him suggested training that went far beyond civilian self-defense classes. The techniques she had used were familiar yet more advanced than anything he had learned in Marine Corps combat training. Most disturbing of all was the calm professionalism with which she had handled the entire confrontation, as if subduing aggressive men was something she did regularly. Yes, Jake finally gasped, his voice barely audible from his prone position. Yes, I understand. I made a mistake. Please let me up. The admission of defeat was painful for someone who had spent his entire adult life projecting strength and dominance, but the alternative was to continue a fight he was clearly losing in front of an audience that was recording every moment. Sarah held him in position for several more seconds, allowing his submission to be clearly established for everyone watching. When she finally released his arm and stepped back, she did so with the same controlled precision that had characterized her entire response to his aggression. Jake struggled to his feet, his face flushed red with a combination of alcohol, exertion, and profound embarrassment. As Jake stood up, nursing his sore arm and struggling to maintain what was left of his dignity, Sarah returned to her bar stool with the same casual ease she had displayed throughout the evening. To anyone who had just arrived, it would have appeared that nothing unusual had happened. Her hair was still perfectly in place, her clothes were unwrinkled, and her breathing was completely normal. The only sign that she had just been involved in a physical confrontation was the slight adjustment she made to her sleeves. Mickey approached cautiously, still holding his phone but no longer certain whether calling the police was necessary or advisable. "Ma'am, are you sure you don't want me to call someone? File a report or something?" His tone was respectful, almost deferential, as he addressed the woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that clearly exceeded anything he had seen in 15 years of breaking up bar fights. "That won't be necessary, Mickey," Sarah replied, using the bartender's name for the first time that evening. Corporal Morrison was just leaving with his friends. "Weren't you, Corporal?" The question was directed at Jake, but her tone made it clear that this was not actually a question but a statement of fact. Jake nodded mutely, his earlier bravado completely deflated by the reality of what he had just experienced. His three friends had risen from their table and were approaching cautiously, uncertain how to handle a situation that had developed far beyond anything they had expected when they decided to spend their evening at the Rusty Anchor. Sergeant First Class David Park, the most senior of Jake's companions, stepped forward with the kind of careful diplomacy that comes from years of military experience. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for my colleague's behavior. This doesn't represent the values of the Marine Corps or the kind of men we try to be." His words were sincere, and his body language suggested genuine respect rather than the condescending attitude that had characterized Jake's approach. Sarah studied David for a moment, evaluating his sincerity and apparently finding it genuine. "Thank you, Sergeant Park. I appreciate that, and I hope you'll make sure Corporal Morrison understands that his behavior tonight was completely unacceptable. Military service is an honor, not a license to harass civilians." The use of David's rank surprised all four Marines, as Sarah had not been introduced to any of them and there were no visible rank indicators on their civilian clothes. Her ability to identify their ranks suggested familiarity with military protocol that went beyond casual observation, adding another piece to a puzzle that was becoming increasingly complex for everyone trying to understand exactly who this woman was. Tony Rodriguez, who had been watching the entire confrontation with growing unease about his team leader's behavior, found the courage to speak up. "Ma'am, may I ask how you knew our ranks? And how you were able to?" He gestured vaguely at Jake, who was still rubbing his sore arm and looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. Sarah smiled for the first time that evening, and the expression transformed her face from merely attractive to genuinely beautiful. "That's an excellent question, Private Rodriguez. The answer might help explain why Corporal Morrison's assumptions about civilians were so problematic." She paused, apparently deciding how much to reveal about herself to these strangers who had just witnessed her capabilities. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I hold the rank of Master Sergeant in the United States Army. For the past 8 years, I've been assigned to the Army's Special Operations Command, specifically with a unit that most people have never heard of and whose existence is not generally acknowledged in public forums." Her revelation sent a ripple of shock through the group of Marines and the nearby patrons who were still listening to every word. Jake's face went pale as the implications of her statement sank in. Special Operations Command was the umbrella organization that included some of the military's most elite units, including Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and other highly classified special operations forces. If this woman was telling the truth, and her demonstrated skills suggested she was, then he had just attempted to intimidate and assault someone whose training and experience made his own look like amateur hour. "Oh God," Jake whispered, the color draining completely from his face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "You're Delta Force, aren't you?" The question came out as barely more than a breath, but, in the silent bar, everyone heard it clearly. Sarah neither confirmed nor denied his guess, but the slight smile that played across her lips was answer enough for anyone paying attention. "What I am, Corporal Morrison, is someone who has spent years learning to neutralize threats with minimal force and maximum precision. What you are is a young Marine who confused rank with respect and military service with a license to harass women." The education of Jake Morrison was continuing in ways that no military training manual could have prepared him for. Not only had he been physically dominated by someone he had assumed was helpless, but he was now discovering that his victim outranked him, had more prestigious training than he could imagine, and possessed skills that made his own combat experience look like basic training. Mike Stevens, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Master Sergeant Mitchell, on behalf of all of us, I want to apologize for what happened here tonight." Jake was completely out of line, and there's no excuse for his behavior. His words carried the weight of genuine remorse, and it was clear that he understood the seriousness of what had just occurred. "Apology accepted, Corporal Stevens," Sarah replied. "But the person who needs to apologize is standing right there, and I haven't heard from him yet." All eyes turned to Jake, who was struggling to find words that could adequately express his regret for what had turned into the most humiliating experience of his life. The confrontation that had begun with Jake's arrogant assumptions about civilian weakness and military superiority was about to conclude with a lesson in humility that would stay with him for the rest of his career. The question now was whether he had learned enough from this experience to become a better Marine and a better man, or whether his ego would prevent him from accepting the hard truths that Sarah Mitchell had just taught him. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the rusty anchor, surrounded by witnesses to his humiliation, facing a woman whose revelation had turned his entire worldview upside down. The silence stretched on as he struggled to find words that could adequately express his regret for what had become the most educational and embarrassing experience of his military career. Every eye in the bar was focused on him, waiting to see if he had learned anything from his encounter with Master Sergeant Sarah Mitchell. "Master Sergeant," Jake began, his voice barely above a whisper as he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. "I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable, disrespectful, and completely contrary to everything the Marine Corps taught me about honor and integrity." He paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate to address what he had done. "I made assumptions about you based on your gender and civilian appearance, and I acted like an entitled bully instead of the professional Marine I'm supposed to be." Sarah listened to his apology with the same calm attention she had displayed throughout the evening, evaluating his sincerity and the likelihood that he had actually learned something from this experience. "Continue," she said simply, her tone indicating that his apology was incomplete. Jake swallowed hard, realizing that a simple sorry would not be sufficient to address the depth of his misconduct. "I harassed you, attempted to intimidate you, and tried to use my military service as justification for behavior that was completely inappropriate. I disrespected not only you, but also the uniform I wear and the institution I serve. There is no excuse for what I did tonight, and I understand that I'm fortunate you chose to use minimal force to stop me." The admission that she had shown restraint was particularly difficult for Jake to voice, but it demonstrated a growing understanding of just how badly things could have gone if Sarah had decided to respond with the full extent of her capabilities. The techniques she had used to subdue him were clearly designed to control rather than injure, a level of professional discrimination that spoke to training far beyond anything he had received. Sarah studied him for a long moment before responding. "Apology accepted, Corporal Morrison. But understanding what you did wrong is only the first step. The real question is whether you'll remember this lesson when you're faced with similar situations in the future. Will you treat women with respect because it's right, or only because you're afraid they might be able to defend themselves?" The question cut to the heart of Jake's character in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. Sarah was forcing him to confront not just his actions that evening, but the attitudes and beliefs that had led to those actions. The lesson she was teaching went far beyond the simple consequences of physical aggression to address the underlying misogyny and entitlement that had driven his behavior. "Master Sergeant, I promise you that I will remember this lesson for the rest of my life," Jake replied, and, for the first time that evening, his words carried the ring of genuine sincerity. "I will treat all people with respect because they deserve it, not because of their ability to defend themselves. And I will never again assume that military service gives me the right to harass or intimidate anyone." Mickey, who had been watching this entire exchange with fascination, stepped forward with a question that had been bothering him since Sarah's revelation. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why did you let this go on as long as you did? You could have ended it much sooner, couldn't you?" Sarah turned to the bartender with a smile that suggested she had been expecting this question. "You're absolutely right, Mickey. I could have ended this confrontation much earlier. But Corporal Morrison needed to learn a lesson that went beyond simply being overpowered by someone stronger. He needed to understand the consequences of his choices and the danger of making assumptions about other people." She gestured toward Jake, who was still processing the full implications of what had just happened. "If I had simply neutralized him immediately, he might have written it off as bad luck or an unusual circumstance. By letting him escalate the situation through his own choices, he was forced to confront the fact that his behavior was wrong regardless of my ability to defend myself." David Park, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, stepped forward with a question that demonstrated his growing understanding of the situation. "Master Sergeant Mitchell, are you saying that this was essentially a training exercise for all of us?" Sarah's response revealed the depth of thought that had gone into her handling of the situation. "In a way, yes, Sergeant Park. Every interaction is an opportunity to learn something, and tonight presented a chance to address some serious misconceptions about military service, civilian capabilities, and the proper treatment of women. Corporal Morrison learned that assumptions can be dangerous. You and your colleagues learned about the importance of intervening when someone is behaving inappropriately. And everyone in this bar learned that military service doesn't excuse harassment or assault." The educational aspect of the evening's events was beginning to resonate with the other patrons who had witnessed the confrontation. Several people approached to thank Sarah for handling the situation with such professionalism, and others expressed their appreciation for the lesson in not judging people by appearances. The construction workers who had been watching from their table came over to shake her hand and express their admiration for her service and her restraint. Tony Rodriguez, who had been struggling with his loyalty to his team leader versus his growing recognition that Jake's behavior was wrong, found the courage to address Sarah directly. "Master Sergeant, thank you for not seriously hurting him. Jake's not a bad person, but he's got some issues with authority and respect that he needs to work on." Sarah's response demonstrated the kind of leadership that had made her successful in special operations. "Private Rodriguez, loyalty to your teammates is admirable, but it shouldn't extend to enabling bad behavior. The best way to help Corporal Morrison is to hold him accountable for his actions and help him become a better Marine and a better person." As the evening wound down, the implications of what had occurred began to sink in for everyone involved. Jake's friends helped him gather his belongings while discussing how they would handle the inevitable questions when word of this incident reached their command structure. The story was too good and too unusual to remain secret, especially with multiple witnesses and cell phone videos that were already beginning to circulate on social media. Sarah finished her whiskey and left a generous tip for Mickey, who had handled the situation with admirable professionalism despite being completely unprepared for what had unfolded in his establishment. As she prepared to leave, she turned to address the group of Marines one final time. "Gentlemen, I want you to remember something important. Military service is an honor and a privilege, not a license for bad behavior. The uniform you wear represents something greater than yourselves, and every action you take reflects on that institution. Use this experience to become better Marines and better men." Jake stepped forward one last time, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Master Sergeant Mitchell, is there anything I can do to make amends for what I did tonight? Any way I can prove that I've learned from this experience?" Sarah considered his question carefully before responding. "Yes, Corporal Morrison, there is. The next time you see someone being harassed or intimidated, intervene. Use your training and your position to protect people instead of threatening them. And remember that real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. As Sarah left the Rusty Anchor that night, she left behind a group of Marines who had learned valuable lessons about respect, assumptions, and the true meaning of service. Jake Morrison, in particular, had undergone a transformation that would influence the rest of his military career and his personal relationships. The confrontation that began with his arrogant assumptions about civilian weakness had ended with him gaining a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a professional soldier. The security camera footage from that evening would eventually be viewed millions of times across various social media platforms, becoming a viral sensation that sparked countless discussions about military culture, gender equality, and the importance of treating all people with respect. But, for the people who were actually present that night, the real value wasn't in the entertainment value of watching a bully get his comeuppance. It was in witnessing a masterclass in conflict resolution, leadership, and the power of using minimal force to achieve maximum educational impact. Jake Morrison returned to Camp Lejeune a changed man, and his subsequent career reflected the lessons he had learned that night. He never again assumed that military service gave him the right to intimidate civilians, and he became known among his peers as someone who would intervene when others behaved inappropriately. The humiliation he experienced at the Rusty Anchor became the foundation for a personal transformation that made him a better Marine, a better leader, and a better man. Sarah Mitchell returned to her quiet apartment that night, satisfied that she had handled a difficult situation without causing unnecessary harm while still delivering an important lesson. She had no way of knowing that the security footage would go viral, or that her actions would inspire countless discussions about the hidden capabilities of seemingly ordinary people. For her, it had simply been another evening when someone needed to learn about respect and consequences, and she had been in a position to provide that education. The Rusty Anchor returned to its normal routine in the days that followed, but the story of what happened that Saturday night became part of the bar's permanent legend. Mickey would tell the story to new patrons for years afterward, always emphasizing the professionalism and restraint that Sarah had shown throughout the confrontation. And, whenever young Marines came into his establishment acting like they owned the place, he would remind them that you never know who you're talking to, and that respect should be given freely rather than demanded through intimidation. The lesson learned that night at the Rusty Anchor was simple but profound. Assumptions about other people can be dangerous. Military service is about protecting others rather than intimidating them, and sometimes the most valuable education comes from discovering just how wrong you were about someone you thought you understood. For Jake Morrison and everyone else who witnessed those events, it was a reminder that heroes don't always look like what you expect, and that real strength is measured by how you treat people who seem weaker than yourself, not by how effectively you can intimidate them.